It's my pleasure to introduce Anders Sandberg. Anders Sandberg is Swedish, he's international, and he's been a long-time transhumanist. He's a specialist in neuroscience, and he's currently a fellow, research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Anders.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and in order to show that I'm a true rebel, of course, I'm daring to wear a tie. Well, I've been thinking quite a lot about human enhancement, and one reason I ended up in Oxford was that I got involved in a project called Enhance, and we were looking at how to cognitively enhance humans. Could we do things to the brain that made it work better? And then, of course, like all good philosophers, we immediately start wondering, what's better? And you can, of course, pick that apart endlessly and get into all sorts of wonderful ethical conundrums. And I've been writing a bunch of papers, both looking into the technological aspects and practical issues of improving brain, as well as some of the ethical and social problems. But today I'm going to be interested in looking at something else. Not just enhancement, but extensions, doing things that the nature never did. So, if we think about human enhancement, quite often we have ideas like this. Ritalin, which, although it was intended mainly for therapeutic uses, are used by quite a lot of college students also in order to concentrate better. Whether it actually helps them academically is an interesting and open question that nobody can really answer. We know that various psychological tests get improved because the normal people who take the right dosage of Ritalin can sometimes concentrate better. We have no real clue whether it would actually be good for their academic output. I would love to do the experiment of taking, let's say, 50 PhD students, give them modafinil, and 50 PhD students get sugar pills, and 5 years later we check their academic record and see who's come up with the best ideas. Unfortunately, I don't think I have the budget or ethical review board who's willing to go through it. And the sad thing is, of course, a lot of enhancements are also pretty boring. Wired magazine had this wonderful idea about some future enhancements. So here is a suggestion for kind of chococeutical. For your love, the Lonely Hearts chocolate. Not just tasty, but it also contains, of course, emotional influencing drugs and chemicals that puts you in the right mood. I don't know if you can read the little labels here, but they have both a chocolate against phobia and one to induce tenderness and so on. Would be lovely, and I think it would sell quite well. The interesting part is, of course, that most of these ones are instrumental. They're intended to enhance something we already got, whether it's our ability to concentrate or our ability to feel tender. We might discuss a bit what, let's say, a better memory actually would be. It's not just a photographic memory where you remember everything, but it should ideally, of course, be that you remember the right thing. And enhancing tenderness, many people get a bit nervous about it. There was an interesting survey where people asked students what the traits they would like to enhance, and only 9% wanted to enhance with kindness. Professor Julian Savulescu exclaimed when he heard it, "They're wrong!" And maybe from a moral sense, well, yes, if there was a pill that made us more kind, we should take it. But there are also interesting other questions here. Most of these ones are instrumental. I have memory in order to do certain things, and if I want to improve my attention to study, well, I do that because I want to get a degree and maybe have a good life. But the enhancements are just tools. They're implementing something. But we can also imagine, of course, non-instrumental enhancements. Things that actually extend our abilities outside the normal range, and maybe do not actually fulfill any practical purpose. So, for example, I'm interested in these extensions. Suppose we added a new sense of some kind. What use would it be? Well, it could perhaps be useful to recognize radioactive radiation if you happen to be close to a nuclear power plant that might be leaking. But it might also be that, well, maybe there are some pleasant experiences of radioactivity. A friend of mine who I've been working on a paper with about this has implanted a magnet in his finger. Okay, it's a slightly gory picture, but the main interesting part is whenever he describes this, about half of people immediately ask him, what's the use of it? The other half, of course, say, oh, where can I get it? or just recognize that, this doesn't necessarily have a practical use, but it has some experiential use. Similarly, we can imagine, for example, contact lenses giving us, again, this is borrowed from Wired, a kind of Canon lens that connects you to a computer, and now you can see augmented reality. But of course, you could imagine using for all sorts of other interesting things. For example, I have always wanted to be able to see flowers in the ultraviolet, just like insects do. Many of our normally plain flowers actually do have patterns that you can only see if you can see in ultraviolet. Now, what's the use of being able to see that pattern of a flower? There is not a practical use, of course. There is not a practical use of watching flowers unless you happen to be maybe in agriculture. But from an emotional, from an aesthetic, from a human perspective, it's quite important, of course. We want to see flowers. We want more beautiful flowers. We want perhaps to experience other aspects of nature. So getting back to Todd's implant, it's interesting because he's been describing how they set out to do this. And they very carefully started thinking about what's the risks. Well, for example, you might get an infection. That's obvious if you put something on the skin. Yeah, so we need to sterilize things carefully. And where should we put it? Well, under a finger, that's rational because the little magnet's going to move as a response to magnetic fields. Which means that you want somewhere where you have a lot of sense of touch. That's going to be painful too. But that means that the fingertip is pretty good. There are other parts, but fingertips are probably pretty good because you can actually extend it for light company. And of course, put it on the left hand, which in the case things go really badly. And so on. They, for example, checked how to avoid immune reactions, and they did various tests. But at the same time, they couldn't, of course, bound all the risks here. For example, one possibility would be that it would have no sensible reaction whatsoever. It actually turned out that quite rapidly Todd's nervous system started to recognize the signals coming from the movement of a magnet, not as touch, but as something different. They were sufficiently uncorrelated, technically speaking, from the touch signal that it could recognize this as magnetic vibrations instead. But that was something we didn't know before the experiment was done. And this was, of course, not an experiment done in a lab, but this was done in some kitchen or at some body modification place. So the interesting thing here is, as he described, was he didn't know what he would expect when he set out. But he noticed that, well, those static magnetic fields, I believed, would be the important part when we started this project, actually are not that interesting. But there are a lot of oscillating little magnetic fields from lots of hidden motors around. And they gave an interesting experience. Apparently, he can sense whether there is enough electric oscillating currents in cables to distinguish them, which could be an instrumental use, but it's also this kind of interesting thing of noticing what a live cable really is. And as he notes, the benefit of insight into electromagnetic device distribution is difficult to analyze, as it leads to a fundamental shift in conception of objects in reality and not any easily judged change. As I like to put it, maybe there are beautiful magnetic fields out there. So far I haven't heard from Todd that he found any particular adorable magnetic field, but maybe there are. The only way we can figure it out is, of course, by trying to touch them. We can't infer it by looking at some data about the vector distribution in space where the magnetic field is, whether this is actually something useful. Okay. So, let's continue here. What these extensions do suggest is that, well, we can actually extend ourselves in interesting ways, but they also cause, of course, yummy ethical problems, which is good for job security for us in the philosophy department. Of course, some philosophers do a bit badly, have to drink a bit of hemlock, but that's only if you go too far according to the Institutional Review Board. So in general, the instrumental uses of enhancement, by now I think the discussion is more or less over. Of course, people are still writing books and papers about them quarterly, but basically we have a pretty good idea about enhancement, some of the issues of justice, distribution, equality. A lot of the ethical positions are kind of drawn, and in the long run I think it's going to settle down, just like heart transplants. I think we're going to see increased acceptance of various forms of enhancement. However, it's usually based on evaluating the expected utility of something versus, of course, the expected risks and costs. Which is tricky, of course, already, because we actually don't know what long-term use of, let's say, a cognition-enhancing drug does, and actually getting, again, an approval for an experiment that is surprisingly hard. We still don't have any good studies on long-term effects of Ritalin, which has been used since the 70s. It's almost a scandal, I think. But, well, that's research funding for you. But that is still relatively objective and easy to handle. The real problem, of course, comes when we're talking about this kind of extension, this kind of aesthetic modifications. Because, well, what is the expected benefit? Todd didn't know when he put that magnet in what he would be experiencing. He might have some ideas. It seems that some of these ideas were completely wrong. He knew some of the risks. Some of the risks were pretty easy to quantify, but what if there are other risks that might turn out later? It seems unlikely that you would get horrible effects of feeling magnetic field, but what if you get your new ultraviolet cells and you realize that you're not looking at the flowers in the same way? You actually preferred your childhood way of looking at flowers. That might be a problem. Now, from an ethics standpoint, is that an important argument against doing ultraviolet vision enhancement? Or does this just mean that, well, yes, it's not for everybody? So in general, this subjectivity causes a lot of interesting problems, because at least the objective risk is something we can take statistics on and discuss, and even when we disagree ethically, it's not too much of a problem to talk about it. But what about when people actually feel differently about it? That's always going to be tough. In particular, I think there are some interesting aspects that these kind of extensions involve exploring the unknown. Here, for example, we see a very remote country. It's some dark continent that we still don't know much about. And of course, we will not know very much about this strange land until we send out explorers. And similarly, in order to extending our human life, well, we cannot find out the utility before we actually test it. We cannot predict it at all because it's something different. Normal enhancements try to take something that exists in our species and make it bigger, longer, faster, stronger. But an extension adds a new dimension. No human had magnetic cells before Todd and some others got these implants. Which means that you can easily go far beyond species typical and find yourself in completely unknown and indeed unknowable conditions. And that's of course interesting, because there is nothing more scary than the unknown to most people, especially of course ethics review boards. What about risks? Oh, we cannot find it out. It's also irreducibly an individual and subjective activity. Then of course there are other interesting things. Well, they lack instrumental use. In a sense it's aesthetics. Well, again, the review board is going to have a bit of time to say, what question are you trying to answer? I'm just trying. What question is that man trying to answer, really? Well, he's maybe not even asking a question. He's testing something, experiencing something. Or in this case, of course, as an advert, he's just being something, and hopefully we should be aspiring to it. Actually, it's quite interesting to think about all the objects in this picture. How many of them are actually instrumental? Well, the room is of course keeping the weather out, but most of the decor is of course not at all instrumental. It's having a lot of cultural, aesthetic, his clothing, well, that's also not very practical actually, but it's doing a lot of other things. In fact, his musculature, most likely he could do perfectly well having a wimpy physiognomy like me. After all, we're living in a modern world, but no, he's been spent a lot of time at the gym kind of getting his muscles, which might have been useful in a much less industrialized era, but they look good, and of course send certain other social signals, and so on and so on. So we're talking about exploration for exploration's sake here, where the benefits are very subjective. So well, as you can guess, we can continue a very long time on this. I'm going to very rapidly run through a few similar examples to try to see what can we say about the ethics of extending ourselves. In science, of course, we have a long and heroic and sometimes rather sad history of self-experimentation. Sometimes it's been working out great, and sometimes quite tragically. People have been, especially in medicine, doing experiments on themselves for a variety of reasons. Some of them very rational, some of them a bit iffy, like naturalism. Oh, the French are doing more self-experimentation, but we Germans, we should I need to try this for the honor of the fatherland. And sometimes just for sheer glory, or even during the Victorian era, to show that you're willing to sacrifice for science. Yes. And I have a little bit of a love for the mad scientist within myself. I really love being able to say that. It's a very romantic view of science, of course, which of course fell out of fashion a bit, but still, there are very good reasons why, as a scientist, you might want to test things. You're getting informed consent from the person who knows the most about it. You're going to have somebody very motivated to filling out the notes and observe what's actually happening. So you're going to have access to the data in unprecedented ways and so on. There is also an element of autonomy. However, there also the problem. You have one test subject who might be very overconfident. So there has been this debate in the medical ethics community, and right now most ethics committees are quite down on self-experimentation. That doesn't stop it from happening. And well, occasionally it even nets people Nobel Prizes, like in the case of Helicobacter pylori. They just swallowed the bacterium and demonstrated, yes, we got ulcers from it. Great paper. Nice Nobel Prize. Of course, if I had died from it, it would have been worse. But they try to control the risk. And I think you can do the same thing. You can treat self-experimenting researchers as any other test subject. It's just that it's a test subject that happens to know an awful lot about the issue. And an interesting example here is Professor Kevin Warwick back at home in the United Kingdom, who first implanted a little RFID tag in himself and then did a neural interface. Again, from a scientific perspective, what was he trying to test? Nothing. He was trying it. And then again, kind of experienced how it was to be connected to a computer. He did various experiments, and from a standard view of scientific papers, this was quite disappointing. It didn't really solve any questions or anything. However, from an ethics point of view, it was interesting. He was raising questions. He was kind of pointing out that humans connected to machines, that's not just something those science fiction authors and transhumans are talking about. Hey, there is one here writing papers. And he was indeed finding out things this way. There are, again, interesting issues about the power this has. One of his students, or actually several of them, have gotten RFID tags implanted. One of them put a computer virus into his. So if he ever goes into a particular room in the university, apparently he's going to infect the very important computer there. So he must never get into that room. I'm not certain this is science. It seems almost like an artwork. A quite intriguing one. It raises a lot of interesting questions in this borderland between ethics and art and science. And I think it's clearly worthwhile doing. But at the same time, the traditional ways of looking at it are, of course, problematic. Similarly, we got body performance art. And artists have, of course, suffered for art in all sorts of ways. They have been crawling over glass, they have scalded their hands, they have whipped themselves, they have gotten themselves committed to mental institutions. All sorts of things that you would never get ethics approval to if it was a scientific experiment. Yet I think many would say, well, what's the artist doing here when he's suspending himself naked from a bridge and hooks through his flesh? That's interesting art. You might, of course, critique it in a lot of ways, but nobody would say, yeah, that's not really worth the risk. Or rather, you would have a very vigorous discussion, and anybody say, oh, our review board has said, no, you're not allowed to do that. We would scream censorship. We're infringing on his self-expression here. And there is a lot of interesting issues here, because, of course, a lot of really good art causes scandal, intentionally. It pushes the boundaries, and quite a lot of this can even go outside the normal boundaries, because we actually want to get into that space, that unknown charted land where nobody has ever been before, where we don't have any ethics or morals to guide us. We need to come up with it now, because suddenly somebody is standing there with the implant or the modification or did that outrageous thing nobody had ever thought about. So clearly there is something interesting going on. Art is not about ethics. It's clear that there might be some artwork that probably are unethical under any circumstances, just like there's some self-experimentation nobody could ever be allowed to do. But there is clearly an important role of this kind of work. Then, of course, we've got the body modification subculture. A lot of it is just aesthetic. But, of course, aesthetics can go very, very far. I don't think the lizard man is kind of species typical, to use the ethicist view. A lot of people get completely outraged by the idea of splitting the tongue, for various cultural reasons. As an artwork causing outrage, it's actually quite interesting. And the body modification culture, of course, do it as self-expression, and quite often say that this has not just emotional, but even spiritual aspects. And quite often you can't explain it to anybody else, you just have to be there. And it frees them spiritually when they free themselves in terms of getting control over the body. And again, the regulations here are interesting because there is, again, a recognition of the risk and a management of it, even within the culture, even when people do it completely outside of course normal healthcare. So, where does that lead us? Well, I think in general, just as in science, there is no strict formula of saying this scientific question is enough to justify doing that somewhat dangerous experiment. I think in terms of self-experimentation and self-extension, there is no strict formula. However, we can try to balance things. We can try to avoid our cognitive biases. The yuck factor, and especially our tendency to look at the negative side and the risk, quite often bias our thinking about it to try to be too cautious. At the same time, of course, we want to avoid our overconfidence. We can do that, for example, by setting up supporting groups, like in the body modification community. But it's also important to recognize the value to society of actually discovering the unexpected, the serendipitous, even the completely challenging things. And that is not just an ethical thing, but an educational one. We need to actually to show people it's a good thing we have a society that's pushing the limit. Why? Well, we're so lousy and predicting the future. The only way of figuring out the future is actually to create it. And then if it didn't turn out so well, let's ignore that one. But that future turned out really well. Let's everybody get it now. And the best thing is, of course, with exploring the unknown, where there might very well be conditions of living, human conditions or transhuman or post-human conditions, which are vastly better, is that there is so much of it. We're not going to run out of the unknown. Rather, we're going to be able to enjoy the wonders of the unknown if we dare explore it. Thank you.